last video, we reviewed a hand played by Magnus Carlsen in a deep cash game where he looked like a natural making an epic hero call. In this video, we'll be reviewing a hand played by Magnus in an MTT with a bit of a different result that will serve as a curt reminder that poker's complexities can humble even the most brilliant of minds.
Wow, so a pure freeze out, pure poker, very rare, especially in Europe, but even very rare anywhere around the globe. This is how poker should be played, and could be in a rough spot with Forberg waking up with the pocket rockets. About Forberg, but that's very difficult. Forberg should be betting with a lot more hands. And Carlsen does call. Oh my God, Magnus Carlsen here gets a dream flop of King 8-9. What a dream for Magnus Carlsen, peeling off that 3-bet. Forberg leading out after 3-betting his rockets. Now how is Carlsen going to approach this? It's still, even though it is a rainbow board, that 8-9 does connect with some of his opponent's holdings for a draw. Are we going to see a call or a raise by the chess legend Magnus Carlsen? Will just call. I like this a lot.
So we're in the early stages of the Norwegian Poker Championship, and Magnus opens the cutoff with 8-8 with around 36 big blinds. Villain wakes up in the small blind with pocket aces, so he 3-bets and Magnus calls, all very standard. The flop is King 8-9 rainbow, and Villain c-bets around 30% and Magnus calls. So in this spot, the pre-flop raiser could choose one of two primary paths. He could target the weaker part of the pre-flop caller's range by betting small, which allows him to fire with most or all of his range. Or alternatively, the pre-flop raiser could leverage his nut advantage and take a more polarized line, targeting the middle part of the caller's range with a larger sizing with his strongest hands and bluffs. However, in Magnus's shoes, there's really just one way to go here, which is to slow play, and this is largely influenced by the SPR. If we rerun the exact same sim, but change the SPR from less than 2 to over 7, we see that the raising frequency increases significantly in the deeper sim. With more chips behind to win, these nutted hands have a strong incentive to accelerate growing the pot, whereas in the short SPR sim, getting stacks in with 2 streets to go and in position should not be too difficult.
You don't want your opponent to fold, and the King of Spades on the turn improves Carlsen further to a full house. Forberg, however, may actually slow down to some degree, but he can never really be folding his aces here. Not to somebody as smart as Carlsen, who could be floating and deciding what to do next, but does check, does slow down. Now it's going to be up to Carlsen to try to get more value out of this hand. There are a couple cards on the river that can actually beat Carlsen, not just the 2 aces, but the 2 remaining kings would both give Forberg a full house, but he doesn't know what Forberg has.
The turn pairs the king, and Forberg decides to slow down, perhaps because he believes Magnus has many hands here that will want to bluff or bet for protection. However, the solver generally prefers barreling here with aces and with most of the range. This king is actually a good card for the pre-flop aggressor because it improves the equity of his strong underpairs, which he has an advantage in, given that it is now less likely that the pre-flop caller has a king. So hands like 10s through queens are certainly going to be strong enough to bet here, especially with the short SPR, as the threshold for stacking off decreases when the effective stack becomes smaller. And having locked up the full house, Magnus decides to continue to slow play, which is consistent with the solver's strategy. However, if the players were deeper, we see that this would be a pure bet to grow the pot with just 1 street remaining.
But even if we put Forberg on an ace-king type of hand, those cards would still apply. But instead, it's a queen of hearts on the river, and Forberg reaching for his chips,
18.
betting 18,000 into a pot of 42,000. What a poker face by Magnus Carlsen. Looking a little troubled by that bet, but expect him to come over the top. Obviously now he's losing to some king queens as well, so we'll see how he approaches it. He shouldn't be concerned so much about the king 9, king 8, but those are possibilities as well. But Forberg wouldn't have been 3-betting those, I don't believe. He's been playing fairly close to the vest, and for him to be 3-betting king queen would have been out of character for Forberg as well. So Carlsen should still feel he has the best hand here. He does just call though, folks.
So the river is the queen of hearts, and Forberg decides to make a small blockish bet. However, the solver prefers shoving here, which again is largely a function of the SPR, as there probably are enough weaker hands in Magnus's range that can call given his passive line, such as Queen X, 9X, and lower pocket pairs. And as for Magnus's check back, well, there's really no two ways about it. This is a massive blunder. According to this sim, pocket 8s is a pure shove, and checking loses around 15,000 chips in EV. So why on earth did this super genius check? Now obviously we can't read Magnus's mind, but from his monologue in the last video, he clearly understands the concept of thinking in ranges. And so if I had to guess, Magnus's decision was the result of him falling prey to something that affects even advanced players, truncated targeting. Since when you're playing, you don't have these nice little charts in front of you and your time is limited, it's not really possible to consider all of the likely combos in Villain's range. So what often happens is people end up only focusing on a narrow portion of Villain's range, which causes their decision to end up being short-sighted. So how do you avoid doing this? Well, there are 3 tips which we will offer that may be helpful to mitigate the effects of truncated targeting, particularly for newer players. First is using range morphologies, which we mentioned in the last couple videos. We've done a whole detailed video on morphologies, but essentially it involves fitting your opponent's range into one of 4 categories based on his prior actions and the board texture. When someone plays in a particular way, it tends to skew his range distribution in a certain predictable manner, and there's usually an effective heuristic that you can apply to maximize your EV against these specific range shapes. So in this case, Villain was the preflop aggressor in a 3-bet pot on a relatively favorable board, which likely made his range balanced with some strong, some medium, and some weak hands. In contrast, Magnus, as the 3-bet caller, likely had a bottom-heavy range, particularly on the rainbow board, with a lot of complete whiffs and other low-equity hands. And when a balanced range matches up with a bottom-heavy range, you'll often see a small bet with very high frequency, as we saw in this case, which means that Forberg's range on the turn likely remained balanced. However, when Forberg checked the turn that was either favorable or at a minimum neutral for him, Magnus checked back, and then Forberg bet small in the river, it likely rendered his range more mid-heavy, as this range shape tends to play passively with checks or small bets. If Villain was holding something very nutted, he would have been more likely to bet on the turn and or bet larger on the river. And even if Magnus was unsure of Forberg's exact range shape here, one thing that was very clear was that it was not polarized, which would be the only morphology that checking back a full house might conceivably make some sense against in select scenarios. As a reminder, a polarized range is usually created when one player takes the initiative and maintains it with large bets generally designed to get stacks in by the river. When a player takes this sort of line, his range tends to become primarily comprised of the very strongest and weakest hands. In other words, a polarized range is largely missing mid-strength hands, which generally do not want to play a big pot, and it is this class of hands that typically bluff catches. So against a polarized range, raising generally becomes less attractive because the opponent doesn't have many weaker hands that can call. You run a higher risk of growing the pot and reopening the action against hands that are stronger, and it's useless to try to extract more value from trash that will mostly just autofold. Now of course, given the SPR and the fact that he was out of position, Forberg definitely could have been slow playing with his line, but poker is a game of probabilities, and so you can't become fixated on the worst case scenario. You have to make plays based on what is most likely, and invoking range morphologies, though not perfect, can be a practical way to avoid truncated targeting, since morphologies capture the probability distribution of the entire range, not just one segment. A second tip that may be useful in value betting situations to help bring clarity and cut through the confusion that can sometimes be caused by excessive range analysis or obsessing over micro details like blockers or equity is to simply ask yourself, how much is your hand worth? And then putting in bets and raises that grow the pot to that size. And 30 big blinds deep with a relatively short SPR, absent extraordinary circumstances, a full house is going to be worth all the chips. In fact, on the flop, Magnus's sole and solitary mission should have been to figure out the most efficient way to get stacks in by the river, regardless of almost any run out. Now, understandably, as a beginner, it can be difficult to assess a hand's relative worth, but one way to quickly build up this intuition is by using a GTO trainer, because it will teach you objectively and measurably each hand's expected value. You can also build this understanding by simply playing through trial and error, but this route tends to be much less efficient due to the substantial role of variance in poker. And the final tip to mitigate the effects of truncated targeting is to focus primarily on the region of villain's range that runs counter to your natural tendencies. So, for example, I'm naturally a risk-averse person, so especially when I first started playing, I had an intrinsic hesitance to pull the trigger on bluffs and thin value bets. So what I forced myself to do when considering whether or not to bluff a weak hand, for example, was instead of focusing on the boogeyman under the bed, i.e. better hands that villain can call with, I would focus on villain's hands that are better, that are likely to fold. The more hands I could think of that fit in this bucket, the more inclined I am to bluff. This sort of perspective switching can be particularly useful for people that may have a negative mindset or are not very confident when playing, like most beginners. And in the case of a perceived thin value spot, like the one Magnus thought he was facing here, instead of focusing on the potential traps in villain's range, such as queens, king-queen, nines, and king-9, you could focus on the weaker hands that may have played this way that can bluff catch, such as perhaps ace-queen, king X, or pocket jacks. The greater number of weaker hands you could think of, the more confident you'll be to fire the value bet. So overall, an interesting hand that just goes to show, no matter how smart you are, you could be one of the greatest strategic minds that has ever lived. Poker is just so immeasurably complex that trying to reason or intuit your way to optimal decisions can be extremely difficult without a significant amount of experience or study that gives you a solid foundation to anchor your decisions to. So that is the video for today. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay balanced.